A second example of this is in free speech law, and you can talk about the marketplace of ideas and how the cure for speech, for bad speech, is not for people to get together and agree, we simply won't say this anymore, but for another person to answer, and for all ideas to compete, for all ideas to be put into the conversation, and then, as people are persuaded, they align themselves with one idea or another. What is that? Fundamentally, that's a competition. Similarly, you might think about what is it that makes a democracy a democracy? And the answer is free and fair elections. All the candidates for office compete against one another, make the very best case possible, and then let the voters decide. And you'll find all kinds of political science theory about how you need to draw sharp distinctions. There are even people who say that this is the reason that negative advertising is good, distasteful though a lot of people find it, because it separates, it shows how the different candidates for office are different from one another so that a voter can make a responsible choice instead of seeing all the candidates as kind of looking pretty much alike. A couple of more examples of this. What the government will often do when it's going to hire a contractor to build something, to take on a project, and the contractor stands to be paid for its work, the government will most efficiently use taxpayer dollars by putting the project out for competitive bidding. Everybody who has the potential to do the work and to do it the best that they can, to do it up to standard, they all put in their bid. Who can do it with the least expense? Who can do it with the least waste to the taxpayer? And this is something I think you could find would be very appealing to your judges, to the people who serve your judging population. If you can talk about saving tax dollars, one of the best ways to save tax dollars is competitive bidding, not a no-bid formula, or you could even characterize in a situation like that the cooperation where the government official and the contractor, they arrive at a decision because they know one another. Well, that's the definition of corruption. That's anti-democratic. So that's a direction that you might kind of want to think in. And a final idea that I'll throw out here is that in the sort of the realm of government and law is you ought to think about groupthink. Do a little bit of research into groupthink. Groupthink is what happens when a committee, when a team, when anybody is deliberating over what to do, when they're gathering information and trying to arrive at a conclusion, and they start to agree too much. And it becomes unsafe to dissent. It becomes unsafe to disagree. And that very often can snowball. One of the events from the past where it's now treated as a classic case study of groupthink, in 1986, the first space shuttle disaster, the Space Shuttle Challenger, there were a whole lot of warning signs leading up to that shuttle launch that said this launch is not safe and we need to take a lot of additional precautions to make sure that this launch doesn't end in disaster. But the NASA officials to whom that information was brought, they fell prey very much to groupthink. They looked at it. Some of them took it a little bit seriously, but others dismissed it. And what they did is they all conformed. They all reached a consensus that was very dysfunctional. They all silenced the ones who wanted to take it seriously. So what you can do in talking about how competition is superior to cooperation is say competition, argument, disagreement is a protection against groupthink. And being too eager to emphasize cooperation is what drives you in the direction of groupthink. Now, I've talked a little bit about law and about law and governments, but the one last thing I want to talk about as far as social institutions is to talk about capitalism versus socialism. And one of the things you'll find that it's one of the biggest areas of business law is antitrust law. Law that doesn't allow different businesses practicing in the same area to do too much cooperating. Instead, it forces them to compete. It will not allow large businesses to buy out too many of their competitors. It will not allow too many businesses in the same area to get together and decide on what the price is going to be. That's something called price fixing. And as you get into that literature that talks about why competition matters, why competition is important, it keeps prices down for consumers. It gives consumers the most different choices. Monopolies, where one business can operate so skillfully that it can corner the market, have all kinds of consequences, and they are a very vivid example and one that's likely to be appealing to your judging population as to why cooperation, taken to its logical extreme, is not nearly as good as competition taken to its logical extreme. Now, those are some beginning ideas. That is by no means the complete list of illustrations that you could go with on the affirmative. And in the videos to come, I plan to talk through a few more. But what I want to do before I finish this is I want to talk about an area that I think you ought to think in the direction of on the negative. Now, I am less convinced that it's strategically wise to have a fully developed case, definitely not a long, fully developed case on the negative, because boy, do you want to save a lot of time for direct refutation of the affirmative case. But if I were to go to an area to pick my illustrations for the negative side, saying cooperation is better than competition, what I would do is it would sound something like this. I would say cooperation is better for any activity that involves the effort of more than one person. I would say that the affirmative examples, many of those examples, talk about teams competing against one another, and each team may compete with outsiders, but internally, that team is still cooperative. If we talk about corporations competing with other corporations, within that corporation, that is a large cooperative body. And my examples here would be, drawing from that, the concept of communication, and in particular technology. Where we have had cooperation, it has gone so much more smoothly and been so much more effective than where we have had competition. And here what I would do is I would talk about the difference between the birth of the Internet and the format wars that we have had when it came to recorded media. There are 2 chapters in what we call the format wars, and you can do a little bit of research on this. Back in the, I guess it was the 1970s, there was a war over which format of videotape was going to win out and which one everyone was going to use. Were people going to use VHS or were they going to use Beta? And there was a contest between them. And the problem was certain movies were made available only on Beta and certain movies only on VHS. So if you had one machine, certain movies weren't available. If you had another machine, then the rest of the movies weren't available. We had a second chapter of this happen just a few years ago. You may actually remember this, between Blu-ray DVD and high-density DVD. And each corporation that was backing one or the other said they're not going to give in, their format is better, they're going to win out in this competition, and the problem was everybody lost because everybody had limited access to the movies that could have been available otherwise and the programming that could have been available otherwise because there was competition to try to see which format would win out. Now, the counterexample, and the one that's just a shining example for cooperation, was the initial setup of the Internet because the protocols, Telnet protocol, hypertext transfer protocol, file transfer protocol, those were all arrived at by consensus and all around the world. If you sent an email, it didn't have to go through 50 different format changes to make it to the different corners of the planet. Anywhere it went, the format was exactly the same. The one other example that could go along with the format wars that's currently going on is the difference between cell phone providers, and that there's difficulty in switching cell phones, and there's difficulty in getting certain things to operate properly because different cell phone providers do things very differently. Now, it's true, you can talk to different cell phones, you can dial someone's cell phone and talk to them, but still, because they don't agree on a standard set of protocols the way they did with the Internet, there are difficulties that we have, especially here in the United States, that you don't find in some other parts of the world where they have established their cell phone protocols with more consensus. So I think that has a lot of potential. For the negative to say, competition a lot of times is destructive, and all competition does is it makes the competitors, it gives them the incentive to each one take a portion, whatever they can get control on, and run away. Not pool it, not share it with other people. And if you develop that, I think you might find that you've got something that's very strategic. So, that's where we start, and I am planning on making a number of more videos to give you some ways to get up and running, and good luck to you.